The Georgia sun was relentless that afternoon as Maurice Carter checked the address on his delivery slip. His shirt stuck to his back, and the hum of cicadas buzzed through the humid air like a warning. He was parked in front of the county police department, a place he never liked being near, even for work. But it was just another drop. In and out. No drama. Maurice was 34, with 2 kids and a wife back home in Decatur. He worked for a growing organic meal delivery service called Garden Fuel. On most days, he enjoyed it. Driving gave him peace. He could listen to sermons, catch up on audiobooks, and keep to himself. But today felt different. He got out of the van and hoisted the large thermal bag over his shoulder. His eyes flicked to the front steps of the station, where a stocky white officer leaned against the railing, sipping coffee. Maurice nodded politely. The officer didn't nod back. As Maurice climbed the steps, the officer straightened up. His face twisted into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Well now, what do we have here?" the cop said loud enough for everyone near the entrance to hear. Maurice paused but kept walking. He wasn't new to this. "I'm delivering for Garden Fuel." "Order was placed for Captain Raymond," he said calmly, holding up the printed order slip. "Oh, delivering meals." "Fancy stuff for you people," the officer said, chuckling. "You sure you didn't sneak in the back and steal this from someone's porch?" Maurice froze. Not because the insult was new, but because this one was bold, loud, intentional. He stared at the officer, keeping his tone level. "I'm just here to drop this off." "Can you tell me where to find Captain Raymond?" The officer stepped in front of him. "You must think you're pretty clever. Ha! Coming in here, acting all innocent. Probably hiding drugs in those little quinoa bowls." Maurice blinked. "Was this real?" "Sir, I don't want trouble," he said. "Just doing my job." A few other officers passing by snickered. No one stopped it. That's when Maurice tapped the small silver pin on his shirt pocket. It looked like a simple brand logo from the company, but inside was something far more serious. A high-resolution microphone and GPS transmitter, issued by the FBI. Because Maurice wasn't just a driver. He was a confidential informant. 3 months earlier, the Bureau had reached out through a lawyer he trusted. They were investigating corruption in the Southern police departments. Racially targeted abuses, missing evidence, cover-ups. And they needed someone quiet, invisible, trusted by the community, but with access to the halls of power. Someone who wouldn't raise suspicion. Maurice had said no at first. He had kids, a wife, a quiet life. But then he thought about his cousin Jacob, arrested at 17 for stealing a candy bar and still sitting in jail on some trumped-up parole violation. He thought about the time he'd been pulled over for driving a used Lexus in a white neighborhood. He remembered the fear in his son's eyes when they passed a patrol car. He said yes. Today was supposed to be routine. Get audio of police staff ignoring certain complaints. Nothing dangerous. But this was different. The officer mocking him wasn't just rude. He was baiting him, and that meant something was off. Maurice made a quick mental note: facial description, voice, badge number if visible. Every detail could matter. The officer wasn't done. "Tell you what, since you're so professional, how about you take your hands out of your pockets real slow? You look nervous. Got anything illegal on you?" Maurice knew the game. The cop was trying to provoke a reaction. One wrong move and things could spiral. "My hands are out, sir." "I'm not a threat," he said, keeping his palms visible. "Oh, you're definitely something. Probably just pretending to be harmless. That's what they all say, right up until they pull a weapon," the cop replied, hand now resting near his holster. Maurice didn't flinch. The mic was hot, every word being transmitted. The front doors opened, and an older officer stepped out. "What's going on here?" asked Captain Harold Raymond, frowning. Maurice pointed at him. "Delivery for you, sir." Raymond looked between them, catching the tension instantly. "Officer Cooper, you got something better to do." Raymond snapped. Cooper's grin dropped, but he didn't apologize, just stepped back. Maurice handed the bag over. Raymond took it, gave him a tired nod. "You all right, son?" "Yes, sir," Maurice said, and walked back to his van, heart pounding. As he pulled away, the message came through his earpiece: "Keep driving. Do not turn around." We heard everything. Back at the Bureau's local surveillance office, Agent Jessica Monroe was already on the phone with her supervisor. "We got Cooper on tape. Racially charged harassment. Attempted intimidation. We might have enough to escalate." Maurice turned onto the freeway, his fingers gripping the wheel tightly. He wasn't just delivering meals anymore. He was delivering truth. And this time, it was headed straight into enemy territory. Maurice Carter didn't feel like a hero. Not when he parked his delivery van outside a busy gas station, turned off the ignition, and just sat there, hands trembling slightly on the wheel. His forehead rested against the steering wheel as he took a slow breath. The air conditioning in the van hummed quietly, but it couldn't cool the fire burning in his chest. He'd just been mocked, threatened, and humiliated, all while doing his job. But beneath that was something bigger. His microphone had captured it all. And now the FBI had real-time evidence of the type of harassment so many Black Americans endured silently for generations. He checked his phone. A secure message blinked at the top of the screen. "We need a full debrief. Drive to Safe House 3. Do not take the highway. Use cleared back roads. Trackers confirm you are not being followed." Maurice opened the glove box, pulled out a folded map, and scanned the marked route. He wasn't just worried for himself. He had 2 children waiting at home, and his wife Kayla would be pacing the floor soon if he didn't check in. But she knew the drill. They'd had to keep his FBI involvement a secret, even from his parents. The fewer who knew, the safer they all were. As he drove through winding back roads, trees lining either side like silent guards, he replayed the encounter at the precinct again and again. Officer Cooper. Heavyset. Southern accent. Sharp blue eyes that looked through you like you didn't matter. It wasn't the first time a man like that had tried to break him. But today, the world would finally hear it for themselves. The safe house was a run-down storage unit near the outskirts of Clayton County, camouflaged with broken signs and a dusty exterior. Maurice parked inside the bay. As the door clanged shut behind him, a hidden door opened at the back. A woman in plain clothes stood there, holding a clipboard. Agent Monroe, 42. White, sharp. Someone Maurice had grown to trust, even though he didn't trust many. She waved him in. "You all right?" she asked, eyes scanning his face. Shaken, but not broken, Maurice replied, handing her the mic pin. She nodded, took it, and walked over to a control panel. Within seconds, his audio file was uploading to a secure server. "We've got the full exchange. Every word. And the Internal Affairs Unit is already being notified," she said. Maurice sank into a metal chair in the corner. He stared at the cement floor, but his thoughts were racing through everything that could come next. Retaliation, discovery, or worse, silence. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. Agent Monroe didn't sugarcoat anything. "We've got more work to do. Officer Cooper's just one piece. We're seeing patterns of behavior across multiple departments. Officers mocking black citizens, ignoring 911 calls from certain neighborhoods, reassigning evidence lockers to cover for their own. Your audio gives us leverage." She sat across from him, eyes steady. "But I need to know you're still in. If you want out, I can call in a replacement. You've already risked your life for this." Maurice didn't speak right away. Instead, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded photo. His daughter Layla, age 6, in a princess dress. His son, Jamal, age 9, in a Little League uniform. Both smiling, innocent, still untouched by the bitterness of the world. "I can't walk away. Not when they're going to grow up in this mess," he said. Monroe smiled faintly. "Then we take the next step." Over the next hour, they reviewed the recording, marking timestamps. Cooper's voice was crystal clear, his laughter, his accusations, his thinly veiled threats. Each word felt like a nail, being hammered into the coffin of a system that had long buried the truth. "We're going to need video next time," Monroe said. "Audio is strong, but video drives public pressure. If it leaks the right way, the community will erupt." Maurice raised a brow. "You want me to wear a body cam?" She pulled a small device from her case. Smaller than a thumb drive. Magnetic. Easily hidden in the collar or under the bill of a cap. "Wears like a charm," she said. Maurice took it, feeling the weight of what came next. This wasn't just about exposing words anymore. It was about exposing faces, names, actions. In real time. As he left the safe house, the afternoon sun had started to set behind thick clouds. The golden light bathed the roads in a soft hue, but Maurice didn't feel warmth. He felt resolve. His next stop was a precinct in a smaller neighboring town, known by locals as a ghost zone for justice. Complaints went in, but rarely came out. His next delivery was scheduled for the next morning, 9:30 sharp. But this time, he wasn't walking in with just lunch. He was walking in with eyes and ears for every voice that had ever been silenced. And the FBI was listening. Back at his apartment, Kayla met him at the door. She didn't ask questions. She just hugged him tighter than usual. "Long day?" she asked. "Yeah," Maurice said. "Real long." He helped tuck the kids into bed, kissed their foreheads, and stepped out onto the balcony with a glass of water. The city lights twinkled in the distance, but beneath that shimmer lay stories most people never heard. Maurice was about to change that. Not with a gun, not with a protest, but with truth. And the whole world was going to hear it. The next morning, Maurice Carter woke up before dawn. The sky was still dark, and the city was quiet. He sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee, the events of the previous day replaying in his mind. The encounter with Officer Cooper had been more than just a moment of racial profiling. It was a stark reminder of the systemic issues that plagued the community. Maurice knew that his role as an informant was becoming increasingly dangerous. The FBI had provided him with a new piece of equipment, a small, discreet body camera that could be hidden in his clothing. Agent Jessica Monroe had emphasized the importance of capturing not just audio, but also visual evidence of misconduct. As he prepared for the day, Maurice thought about his family. His wife, Kayla, had been supportive but worried. Their children, Layla and Jamal, were too young to understand the risks their father was taking. He kissed them goodbye, promising to be home in time for dinner. Maurice's first delivery was to a precinct in a neighboring town, known for its history of complaints against officers. The FBI had received tips about misconduct there, and Maurice's task was to gather evidence. He arrived at the precinct, the body camera securely in place. As he entered the building, he was greeted by Officer Thompson, a tall man with a stern expression. "Delivery for Captain Harris," Maurice said, holding up the bag. Officer Thompson looked him up and down, a smirk forming on his face. "You people always find a way in, don't you?" he said. Maurice remained calm. "Just doing my job, sir." Thompson took the bag and handed it to another officer. "Make sure this isn't tampered with," he said, loud enough for others to hear. Maurice turned to leave, but Thompson stepped in front of him. "Hold on. We need to check your vehicle." "Is there a problem?" Maurice asked. "Standard procedure," Thompson replied. Maurice knew this wasn't standard. He also knew the body camera was recording everything. Outside, officers searched his van, pulling out containers and inspecting them. Passers-by stopped to watch, some taking out their phones. After an hour, they found nothing. "You're free to go," Thompson said, his tone dismissive. Maurice drove away, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He contacted Agent Monroe, informing her of the incident. "We have it all on video," she said. "This is exactly what we needed." Back at the safe house, They reviewed the footage. The officer's actions were clear violations of protocol, and the racial undertones were undeniable. "This is going to make an impact," Monroe said. "But we need more." Maurice nodded. He was committed to the cause, despite the risks. Over the next few weeks, Maurice continued his deliveries, each time capturing more evidence of misconduct. Officers making derogatory comments, unnecessary searches, and blatant abuse of power. The FBI built a case, compiling the footage and testimonies. They planned to present it to the Department of Justice, aiming to initiate a federal investigation. Maurice's role became more critical, but also more dangerous. Word began to spread among the officers about a possible informant. Suspicion grew, and Maurice had to be more cautious. One evening, as he returned home, he noticed a car following him. He took several turns, trying to lose it, but it stayed on his tail. Finally, he pulled into a crowded gas station, and the car drove past. He reported the incident to Agent Monroe. "Well, increased surveillance," she said. "Your safety is our priority." Despite the danger, Maurice continued his work. He believed in the mission to expose the corruption and bring about change. The evidence gathered was substantial. The FBI prepared to make their move. But Maurice knew that the hardest part was yet to come. Maurice Carter was used to silence. Not the peaceful kind that came with early morning drives or family dinners after a long day. This silence was the kind that made your skin crawl. The kind that followed you into a room like a shadow. The kind that let you know someone was watching. It was Thursday morning, and the sky outside his apartment was grey, draped in clouds that threatened rain. Maurice had barely slept. The memory of that dark sedan following him the night before clung to him like a bad scent. He moved around the apartment in a haze, checking every lock twice and pulling his hoodie low over his head when he left. The delivery on his schedule today was no ordinary run. The client was listed as a private training event at a suburban precinct known for its decorated history and aggressive officers. According to Agent Monroe, the precinct had been flagged in multiple internal memos, but was too well connected to touch without hard evidence. This was where Maurice had to go next. Before leaving, he kissed Kayla on the forehead. Her eyes were still closed, but she mumbled a soft, "Be careful." It hit harder than usual. His kids were still asleep. He stared at their bedroom door a little longer than usual. The route was quiet. Too quiet. Maurice felt that familiar burn of nerves in his gut. He gripped the wheel tight and glanced into the rear-view mirror every few seconds. No followers this time. Not yet. He pulled up to the precinct around 9:45 a.m. The building was spotless, the landscaping precise. It looked more like a private school than a place where misconduct festered beneath the uniforms. He parked in a visitor space and grabbed the bag of food from the passenger seat. Inside, the receptionist, a young blonde woman named Sarah, gave him a forced smile. "Delivery for Lieutenant Blake," Maurice said. Sarah picked up the phone without a word and muttered something. A moment later, an officer emerged from a hallway to the left. He was tall, with a buzz cut and piercing eyes. His badge read Blake. "You the driver?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Maurice said, trying to keep his tone neutral. Blake took the bag without saying thank you. Instead, he looked Maurice up and down and added loud enough for others to hear, "Looks like the food's not the only thing late." A few officers chuckled. Maurice felt the sting in his chest, but said nothing. The body cam was recording every second. He turned to leave. "You got ID on you?" Blake called after him. Maurice froze. "I already gave my name when I came in." "You black boys think you're slick, don't you? You think we don't notice when something's off?" Maurice turned slowly, controlling every breath. "Sir, is there a problem?" "Just a question," Blake said, stepping closer. "You been in this building before?" Maurice shook his head. "Never." Blake leaned in. "See, the funny thing is, we've had some recent issues with leaks. Someone's feeding stories to reporters. Or maybe to someone higher up. Sound familiar?" Maurice didn't answer. He could feel the other officers watching. Blake smiled. "Just kidding," he said with a wink that didn't match the coldness in his eyes. "But next time, maybe don't wander around. Some places are off limits." Maurice nodded and walked out, heart pounding so hard it hurt. In the van, he took a moment to collect himself. His hand trembled as he turned the ignition. He made a direct line to the safe house. When he arrived, Agent Monroe was already there. She played the footage back with a grim expression. This wasn't just a racial job. Blake was hinting, testing him. "They know someone's watching," she said. "They might not know it's you, but they're starting to sniff around." Maurice sat heavily in a chair. "It's getting hotter out there," he said. Monroe looked at him directly. "You still in?" He didn't hesitate. "I didn't come this far to run now." She gave a small nod and opened a case on the table. "We're upping your gear. From today, you'll wear a dual band transmitter. It links to our mobile van team. If something happens, they'll be close." She handed him a tiny earpiece and a second body cam, even smaller than the first. "You're officially deep cover now. And Blake, we're making him the priority. He's more dangerous than we thought." Maurice nodded. He could feel it too. There was something in Blake's eyes that went beyond authority. It was hatred masked as discipline. And it had the potential to burn everything down. He returned home late that evening. Kayla was on the balcony, staring out at the city lights. He sat beside her. For a while, they didn't say anything. "You sure it's worth it?" she finally asked. Maurice didn't answer right away. He looked down at the street, where a black teenager in a hoodie walked with a backpack. A squad car slowly crept behind him. "It has to be," he said. That night, as he lay in bed, Maurice dreamt of fire, of uniforms and broken radios, of Kayla screaming and his kids hiding beneath a table. He woke up in a sweat. The mission was no longer about gathering evidence. It was about surviving long enough to deliver it. And Blake was watching. The next few days were a blur of deliveries, surveillance, and quiet moments of introspection. Maurice was careful, too careful. And the pressure of knowing that every move he made could tip the balance between success and failure weighed on him more than anything else. He felt the eyes of the officers on him, always watching, always judging. The subtle threat that loomed over his head was enough to make every conversation with Kayla or his kids feel like it might be the last. Despite the looming danger, the FBI team had made significant progress. They had been tracking Blake's movements and had gathered valuable intel. Maurice's recordings from the precinct had started to paint a clearer picture. It was becoming evident that Blake wasn't just some rogue officer. He was the linchpin in a network of corrupt individuals within the department, using his position to further personal agendas. But there was something else. Something Maurice couldn't quite put his finger on. Blake's interactions with other officers, particularly his off-hand remarks about fixing things, began to hint at deeper, more sinister activity. They were no longer just police officers making small, town mistakes. These men and women were part of something larger, something far more dangerous. As the sun dipped below the horizon one evening, Maurice found himself once again in the familiar seat of his van, ready for his next delivery. This time, though, something felt different. There was an edge to the night air that didn't sit right with him. He checked his phone for any updates from the team. Nothing. He glanced at the body cam, checked it again, double-checked the batteries, and then started the engine. The route was typical. Through the back streets, past the usual areas. But then, just as he was about to take a right turn onto Pine Avenue, a black SUV suddenly sped up behind him. Maurice's heart skipped a beat. The same car. He didn't panic, though. His hands were steady on the wheel as he kept driving, turning onto a side street and pulling into an alley where he parked the van. The SUV followed. Maurice's mind raced. There was no mistaking it. The vehicle had followed him before, but it had never been this close. This time, they weren't playing cat and mouse. They were ready to make their move. He sat quietly, watching the SUV pull to a stop about 20 feet behind him. The streetlights cast long shadows on the asphalt, stretching over the sidewalk in eerie patterns. The driver's side door opened, and Maurice's breath caught in his throat. A figure stepped out, wearing a dark jacket, the silhouette unmistakable. Blake. Maurice immediately reached for his phone. He tapped in the emergency code he'd been given by Agent Monroe and sent a quick text. Blake's here. I need backup. No. Then he sat in silence, watching as Blake approached. The officer's face was unreadable. He didn't seem angry, nor did he look like he was about to strike. But the calmness in his expression made the situation all the more unsettling. Maurice cracked the van's window. "What's up, Blake?" he asked. trying to keep his voice even. Blake leaned in, his voice low. "Maurice, you're a good guy, but I'm not blind. We know what's going on. We know you've been talking." Maurice's heart hammered in his chest. It took everything in him not to panic, to keep his voice steady. "I don't know what you're talking about." Blake smiled. A cold, unsettling smile. "You're the one who doesn't know. You think this is about just one officer? About some petty corruption? This goes deeper than you can imagine, Carter. You're in over your head." Maurice felt the words hit him like a punch to the gut. He'd known Blake was dangerous, but this was something else. This wasn't just about power. This was about survival. Blake continued, the words coming out slowly, deliberately. "I've been patient, Maurice. I've watched you. You're smart. But there's only so much you can do with that body camera of yours. The thing is, you don't know who's watching you, do you? You think you're being clever, but you've got eyes on you too." Maurice didn't respond. Instead, he focused on controlling his breathing. This was no longer just about collecting evidence. He was in the middle of something much bigger than he'd imagined. Blake took a step back, his eyes narrowing. "You've been warned. Keep this up, and you won't make it out of here. Next time, I won't be so nice." With that, Blake turned and walked back to the SUV. He didn't look back as he got in, slammed the door, and sped off into the night. Maurice sat there for a long time, his heart racing. He could barely process what had just happened. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even an attempt to intimidate him. It was a statement of fact. Blake was willing to end this now. He was willing to make it personal. Maurice didn't wait any longer. He called Agent Monroe, his voice shaking as he recounted the encounter. She listened carefully, then replied, "Maurice, you've crossed into dangerous territory. I knew it was coming, but now we've got to act quickly. This is bigger than anything we anticipated." Maurice's pulse still hadn't slowed. "What do we do?" "We play the game. We finish what we started," Monroe said. "But this is the final stretch. No more second chances. Are you in?" Maurice stared out the van's window, the city lights flickering in the distance. It was time to take the risk. He had already made it this far. There was no going back now. "I'm in," Maurice said. The plan was set into motion. Maurice barely slept that night. The adrenaline still coursed through his veins as the words Blake had spoken echoed in his mind. He had known things were going to escalate, but hearing it from Blake himself made the stakes feel real. This wasn't just about proving corruption. This wasn't just about exposing a system that had failed so many. This was about survival. At the crack of dawn, Maurice was on the move again. He drove his usual route, eyes flicking from the rearview mirror to the road ahead. The black SUV had spooked him, but he wasn't going to let fear dictate his actions. He needed to focus. He needed to stay calm. He pulled up to the designated spot for his delivery. A quiet office building tucked away in a corner of the city. This place was a front. A perfect place for the bad apples in the department to hide. As Maurice entered the building, he was hyper, aware of his surroundings. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of voices behind him, made him jump. He wasn't sure who was friend or foe anymore. Inside, the receptionist, a middle-aged woman named Patricia, smiled as he approached. Her smile seemed forced, almost too cheerful, but she said nothing as Maurice handed her the delivery. He quickly turned on his heel and walked toward the exit. But as he reached for the door, a voice stopped him in his tracks. "You're in a bit of a hurry, aren't you?" The voice was familiar, blunt and authoritative. "Lieutenant Blake." Maurice turned slowly, his breath caught in his throat. Blake stood at the entrance of a hallway, arms crossed, watching him like a hawk. "I was just leaving," Maurice said, his heart pounding. Blake didn't move. "I told you to be careful." "You've been making some waves, Carter. People are talking." Maurice's mind raced. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes now. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment that would determine the success or failure of everything he had worked for. "I'm just here to do my job," Maurice replied, keeping his voice steady. "I don't know what you think you know." But Blake cut him off with a sharp laugh. "That's the thing, Carter. You don't know anything. You think you're playing some game with me, with us, but the truth is, you're way out of your depth. You think you're protecting your little family, your kids, but you're not. Not anymore." Maurice's blood ran cold. The last few days of tension and paranoia seemed to collapse in on him in that moment. Blake wasn't just talking about the investigation. He was talking about Maurice's life. "You've been watched this whole time," Blake said, his tone now cold and calculating. "We've got people in place, Carter. Everywhere you go. You don't get to leave here. You don't get to leave this building." Maurice felt the world tilt. Every part of him screamed to run, to get out of there before it was too late. But Blake's voice held him in place. "You think Monroe's got your back? She doesn't. She's just as much a part of this as anyone else." Maurice took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He knew this wasn't just a threat. This was the trap, and he was walking straight into it. But he couldn't let Blake see his fear. Not now. "What do you want, Blake?" he asked, his voice steady, but with an edge of anger that surprised even him. Blake's smile was small and cruel. "Simple. We're going to have a little chat. And you're going to tell us everything you've been hiding." Everything. Maurice knew there was no way out. If he resisted, it would all be over. He'd never make it out of this building alive. But if he went along with it, if he played Blake's game, he could buy enough time to call for backup. He just had to play it smart. "I'm listening," Maurice said, stepping forward slowly. Blake motioned for him to follow, and Maurice did so without hesitation. They walked down the hallway, deeper into the building, toward a back office that Maurice knew was probably where the worst of it happened. His gut churned. As they passed by several rooms, Maurice caught glimpses of officers watching him through the cracks indoors, their faces expressionless, but the tension in the air was palpable. He knew that if he made a wrong move, if he said the wrong thing, they wouldn't hesitate to do what they had to do to silence him. Blake stopped in front of a door at the end of the hallway and opened it with a soft creak. Inside, a small conference room sat under harsh fluorescent lighting. It looked sterile, clinical, like something out of a movie. Maurice couldn't help but feel the weight of what was about to happen. "Sit," Blake commanded. Maurice sat down at the table, his mind racing. Blake took a chair across from him, folding his arms again. He studied Maurice like a specimen under a microscope. "I'm going to ask you one more time, Carter," Blake said, his voice lower now, almost conversational. "What do you know?" Maurice's mind spun. This wasn't just about the corruption. This was about power. This was about control. And Maurice had to find a way to break free. He had to find a way to turn this around. "I don't know anything," Maurice said, his voice firm despite the rising fear in his chest. "But you're about to find out." "I've got the truth, Blake. And it's coming for you." Blake's eyes narrowed, and for a brief second, the air in the room grew thick with tension. Maurice could see it now. This wasn't just an interrogation. It was the beginning of the end. He could feel the walls closing in on him, but he refused to break. Not now. Not ever. The minutes stretched on like hours as Blake leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Maurice with an intensity that made it feel as though the room was closing in. Maurice's heart pounded in his chest, but his face remained impassive. He had learned long ago that showing fear only invited more pressure. Blake needed him to crack, but Maurice wasn't about to give him the satisfaction. "You think you're in control here," Blake said slowly, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "You think you can just waltz in, playing the hero, and think you'll walk out of here unscathed. But you're in deeper than you realize, Carter. You're playing a game that's already been won." Maurice didn't flinch. He leaned back slightly in his chair, meeting Blake's gaze head-on. If Blake thought he could intimidate him into giving up, he was mistaken. "It's not about control," Maurice said, his voice calm but firm. "It's about doing the right thing. And you know, deep down, that this whole system is rotten. You might think you have the upper hand, Blake, but you're wrong." Blake's eyes narrowed, his expression growing more hostile. "You don't get it, do you? This is bigger than you, Carter. This isn't about right and wrong. This is about survival. And if you want to keep breathing, you're going to have to stop pretending like you're some saint and start making deals. Start choosing sides." Maurice swallowed hard. The words stung because he knew they weren't entirely false. The system wasn't built for people like him. And as much as he wanted to believe in the idea of justice, in the notion that right would eventually triumph over wrong, the reality was far less clear. But Maurice wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. "I've seen enough, Blake," Maurice said, his voice steady. "You're not the first corrupt officer I've come across. And you won't be the last. But I'm not backing down. The truth is coming, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." Blake's face contorted in rage. He stood up suddenly, slamming his hand down on the table, making the papers and pens scattered across it jump. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're a fool. This isn't about truth. This is about power, Carter. And right now, I have it." Maurice stood as well, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He could feel his pulse quicken. But he forced himself to remain calm. He was so close to exposing the truth. He couldn't afford to lose his nerve now. The door to the office suddenly opened, and a figure stepped inside, interrupting the tense standoff. It was a woman, tall and composed, her dark eyes sharp and calculating. Maurice didn't recognize her at first, but there was something familiar about her presence. Blake's expression shifted from fury to surprise, though he quickly masked it with a forced smile. "What's this, Blake?" the woman asked, her voice smooth, almost too calm. "You're trying to intimidate our guest here." Maurice blinked, trying to place her. Something about her felt off. She wasn't dressed in the usual police uniform. In fact, she wasn't dressed like an officer at all. Her attire was far more professional, almost corporate, which immediately raised red flags. "This is none of your business," Blake snapped, his temper still evident, but now restrained. "I'm handling this." The woman's lips curled into a smile, though there was no warmth in it. "I think you're mistaken, Blake. This is very much my business." She stepped further into the room, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Maurice's instincts told him to stay alert. There was something deeply unsettling about this woman, something that made him feel like the walls were closing in even further. "I'm Agent Victoria Dawson," she said, her voice cool but authoritative. "I think it's time we end this little game of yours, Lieutenant. It's over." Blake's demeanor shifted yet again, his jaw tightening. "You don't know what you're talking about, Dawson. This doesn't concern you." "Oh, but it does," she replied. "You see, I've been tracking this operation for months now, and it's all connected. Your little game. It's part of a much larger operation that goes all the way to the top." Maurice's mind raced. This was it. This was the break he had been waiting for. It was clear now that the corruption Blake was involved in wasn't just a few bad apples in the department. It was a network, a system that spanned much further than anyone had realized. Blake's eyes flickered toward Maurice, but the anger was gone, replaced by a palpable sense of fear. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice betraying his unease. "We want everything," Dawson said, her voice sharp and commanding. "We want the full picture, and we're going to get it." starting with you." Maurice took a step back, trying to process the weight of what was happening. He had been so focused on surviving Blake's threats that he hadn't considered the possibility someone else, someone much higher up the chain, was pulling the strings. And now, with Agent Dawson's arrival, everything had changed. He wasn't just fighting Blake anymore. He was fighting a system that went far beyond one man's corruption. Dawson glanced at Maurice, her eyes softening just slightly. "I've been following your progress, Mr. Carter. You've done well to get this far, but it's time to finish this." Maurice nodded, still struggling to process it all. It was a relief to know that someone else was on his side, but it also meant that the danger had just escalated. The stakes had become much higher. This wasn't just about exposing corruption in one precinct anymore. This was about taking down a massive criminal enterprise. Dawson turned back to Blake, her expression hardening. "I suggest you cooperate, Lieutenant. This won't end well for you if you don't." Blake's face twisted in anger, but there was something else in his eyes now. Fear. It was the fear of someone who realized they were no longer in control. It was the fear of someone who knew they had been outplayed. Maurice stood silently as the room seemed to hold its breath. It was happening. The reckoning had arrived. The truth was about to be exposed. And there was no going back now. Agent Dawson's presence had shifted the entire dynamic in the room. Blake, once a powerful figure in Maurice's mind, now appeared small and fragile. Maurice could see the fear in Blake's eyes. A man who had always controlled others, now staring down the barrel of his own undoing. Blake was no longer in charge of this situation, and that realization weighed heavily on him. Maurice, on the other hand, felt a surge of hope. This was the moment. It was the one he had been fighting for, the one he had hoped for, when he first set out on this dangerous journey. Dawson's arrival had been the signal he needed. The beginning of the end for the corrupt officers who had believed they were untouchable. But even as hope began to bloom, something gnawed at Maurice. He hadn't come this far just to watch the bad guys get arrested. He wanted justice. Real justice. He wanted the kind of accountability that made a difference, that changed the system. And he had a feeling that Agent Dawson wasn't going to be as straightforward as he hoped. Dawson turned back to Blake, her voice low but cold. "I think you know what's coming, Lieutenant. And I think you know that you're not walking away from this one." Blake's face twisted into a sneer, but there was no conviction behind it. "You think you're going to take me down? You think your little team of feds is going to hold me accountable? You've got no idea what you're dealing with." Dawson stepped forward, her expression unflinching. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with, Blake. And trust me, your days of pulling the strings are over." Maurice's mind was racing. He could sense that something wasn't right. Something wasn't adding up. Dawson's confidence was too calculated too rehearsed. She spoke as if this was all a done deal, as if the outcome was already sealed, and that was unsettling. Maurice took a step closer to Dawson, his eyes narrowing. "You're not here just to take him down, are you?" Dawson's lips curled slightly. "What do you mean?" Maurice leaned in, his voice steady but filled with suspicion. "You've been tracking Blake for months, you said. But why show up now? What's your angle?" Dawson raised an eyebrow, her gaze cool and detached. "I'm here to make sure Blake answers for his crimes. And I'm here to make sure the truth is exposed. That's all you need to know." Maurice felt a cold shiver run down his spine. It wasn't the answers he had been expecting. Dawson wasn't here just to root out corruption. There was something more. And he wasn't sure whether that something was going to be in his favor. Blake, clearly fed up with the back and forth, spat. "You don't know who you're dealing with. You think you can just walk in and—" Dawson cut him off with a sharp motion. "Shut up, Blake. I'm done with your threats. Your games are over." Maurice could see the shift in the room as Dawson moved closer to Blake. He could feel the weight of the moment. It was all coming to a head, and yet there was an unsettling silence in the air. Blake's once iron grip on the situation had slipped, but that didn't mean he was beaten. He was dangerous. Cornered animals always were. Then, just as Maurice thought he understood the dynamics, Dawson's next words hit him like a slap in the face. "You've been useful, Maurice," Dawson said, her voice now completely devoid of warmth. "But now, I think we're done with you." Maurice froze, his mind reeling as the words sank in. Done with him. He had been the one fighting to expose Blake's corruption. He had been the one putting himself on the line. And now Dawson was saying this. "What do you mean?" Maurice said, his voice trembling with disbelief. "I've been helping you. I've been doing everything you asked me to." Dawson's expression didn't change. It was almost robotic in its lack of empathy. "You've been a pawn in a much bigger game, Maurice. And now, your usefulness has expired." Maurice's heart dropped into his stomach. He felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. He had trusted Dawson. He had believed that she was here to help, to end the corruption that had taken everything from him. But now it seemed like he had been nothing more than a tool to her. "You lied to me," Maurice said, his voice rising with anger. "You used me!" Dawson's eyes narrowed, her patience wearing thin. "I didn't lie to you. I told you the truth when I said I needed you. But now I'm telling you the truth again. This is bigger than you, and it's bigger than me. And you're in over your head." Maurice's mind raced. How could this be happening? Everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed, was suddenly unraveling before his eyes. The truth was no longer in his hands. The system he had been fighting to expose was still in place, just as corrupt, just as unyielding. And now, Dawson was playing him just like Blake had. Maurice took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. There had to be a way out of this. There had to be something he could do. But for the first time since this nightmare had begun, he didn't have the answers. The betrayal stung, but he wasn't about to let it break him. He had come too far to quit now. "I'm not done yet," Maurice said, his voice low but fierce. "You might think you've won, but I'll make sure the truth comes out. No matter what it takes." Dawson gave him a pitying look, almost amused. "You don't get it, do you, Maurice? You're not the one who gets to decide when this ends." Maurice clenched his fists, but there was no fear in his eyes, just determination. If Dawson thought she had the upper hand, she was sorely mistaken. Maurice stood there, his thoughts racing as the reality of the situation began to settle in. He had been used, manipulated, and betrayed by the very people he had trusted to bring justice. Agent Dawson had turned out to be another cog in the system he had been fighting to expose. And now, it seemed, there was no one left to trust. But even in the face of this betrayal, something inside him refused to give up. He couldn't let the truth be buried. Not after everything he had sacrificed. "You're playing a dangerous game, Dawson," Maurice said, his voice calm, but filled with an underlying intensity. "You think you've won, but you haven't. The truth is still out there, and I'm going to make sure it comes to light." Dawson's cold, calculating eyes met his, but there was no sign of concern in her expression. She had expected Maurice to resist, to fight back. It didn't matter. She had already moved past him. He was just another obstacle, one she had already decided to neutralize. But Maurice was different. He wasn't going to go down without a fight. "We'll see," Dawson replied, her tone dismissive. "You're not in control anymore, Maurice. You're a pawn in a much bigger game, and you've played your part. It's over." Maurice's anger flared at her words, but he forced himself to stay focused. He had to think. He had to figure out a way to turn the tide. In that moment, it hit him. Dawson had underestimated him. She had thought he was just a pawn, a tool to be used and discarded. But Maurice wasn't just some figure on a chessboard. He was the one who had uncovered the truth, who had fought back when no one else would. And he still had one weapon left: the people. There was no time to waste. He needed to contact his allies, the ones who had supported him from the start. Lisa, the employee who had been wronged by the corrupt officers. His lawyer, Derek, who had been working behind the scenes to gather evidence. And even the few good cops who had remained loyal to the cause. Together, they could take down Dawson and Blake, and anyone else who was part of the web of corruption. Maurice turned to face Dawson, his resolve hardening. "You're wrong, Dawson. You may think this is over, but it's not. You've underestimated me, and now you're going to pay for it." Dawson's eyes narrowed, her smile never faltering. "I don't think you understand, Maurice. I'm the one with all the power here. I'm the one who controls this operation. You're just a small part of it. And now you're in my way." The tension in the room was thick, like the calm before a storm. Maurice knew that Dawson wasn't going to back down, and neither was he. The game had shifted, and now it was a battle of wits. But Maurice was done being the pawn. He was ready to play the game on his terms. "I've been in your way from the beginning," Maurice said, his voice steady. "And I'm not going anywhere." Dawson seemed to weigh his words carefully, as if contemplating her next move. Maurice could see the calculations behind her eyes. She was trying to figure out how to eliminate him once and for all. But Maurice wasn't going to make it easy for her. Blake, who had been silent for several moments, finally spoke, his voice dripping with venom. "You're not going to win, Carter. You think you can outsmart us, but you're just another fool. You'll be buried with all the others who tried to take us down." Maurice's gaze flicked toward Blake, but he didn't let the words sink in. This was bigger than Blake now. It was bigger than Dawson. This was about bringing down a corrupt system that had been in place for far too long. And Maurice wasn't going to stop until it was exposed. "You're right about one thing, Blake," Maurice said, his voice low and deliberate. "I am just another fool. But I'm a fool with a plan. And that's something you'll never understand." Dawson stepped forward, her face tight with frustration. "You really think you're clever, don't you, Maurice? But all you're doing is digging your own grave. You're a fool who thinks he can make a difference. But this game is over, and you've lost." Maurice felt a flash of doubt, but he pushed it aside. Dawson had been playing him all along, using his determination against him. But he had learned something valuable through all of this. He had learned how to fight back. He wasn't going to play by her rules anymore. He wasn't going to let her control the narrative. Maurice's mind was racing, but something told him that the final move was close. He had to act quickly. Before Dawson made her next move, he had one final trick up his sleeve, something that would take Dawson by surprise. It was risky, but it was the only chance he had. "I'm not finished yet," Maurice said, his voice firm and unwavering. "I've got one more move to make." Dawson's eyes flashed with irritation. "I don't have time for your games, Maurice. This ends now." Maurice ignored her, his mind already formulating the plan. It would take every ounce of cunning he had, but if he played his cards right, he could turn the tables. And this time, Dawson wouldn't see it coming. With every second that passed, the walls around him seemed to close in tighter. But Maurice wasn't afraid. He had been backed into corners before, and he had always found a way out. He wasn't about to let Dawson, or anyone else, win this fight. The game of shadows was far from over, and Maurice Carter was determined to be the one who came out on top. The tension in the room thickened with every passing second, and Maurice's pulse quickened as he prepared to make his move. His mind raced through a series of scenarios, each more dangerous than the last. But there was something that Maurice had learned through all of this. The unexpected often came when you least expected it. And just as Dawson was ready to close in on him, Maurice sensed a shift in the air. It happened in an instant. A sudden movement, a quiet knock on the door that echoed in the silence of the room. Maurice's instincts kicked in immediately. His first thought was that it was more trouble, more enemies closing in. But then, something strange happened. Dawson didn't react the way she would have if it was someone trying to stop them. Instead, she paused, her cold, calculating demeanor faltering for a moment. Maurice's eyes flicked to the door as Dawson's gaze hardened. She didn't say a word, but moved quickly to stand near it. Blake, still trapped in his seat, shifted nervously, clearly confused about what was happening. Maurice, too, was unsure of what to make of it. The door opened just a crack, and a figure slipped inside. A tall, lanky man dressed in a black suit. His face was familiar, though Maurice couldn't place it at first. But as the man fully entered the room, everything clicked. It was Derek, his lawyer, the one who had been helping him navigate the legal side of things from the shadows. Maurice's heart skipped a beat. Derek's presence was unexpected. And in this high-stakes moment, it was the last thing Maurice had anticipated. He had no idea how Derek had gotten into the building, but he couldn't ignore the timing. It was perfect. Derek's entrance threw off Dawson's focus, giving Maurice the opening he needed. Dawson looked at Derek with cold suspicion, her eyes narrowing. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice sharp and commanding. Derek didn't flinch. His gaze was steady and unwavering as he stepped further into the room. "I'm here to make sure Maurice gets the justice he deserves," he replied. His voice calm, but filled with a quiet authority that caught everyone off guard. Maurice couldn't believe his ears. The last time he had spoken to Derek, the lawyer had been working from behind the scenes, helping him piece together the legal evidence to bring down the corrupt officers. But he hadn't expected Derek to be so bold, to risk everything and walk straight into the lion's den. Dawson scoffed, a dark smile spreading across her face. "You think you can just waltz in here and change the course of this investigation? This is bigger than you, Derek. Bigger than Maurice. You're wasting your time." Derek remained calm, but Maurice could see the fire in his eyes. He wasn't backing down. No. Derek was here to fight, and his presence alone shifted the power dynamic in the room. Maurice could feel it. Dawson might have thought she had all the power, but now she was on the defensive. She wasn't in control anymore. Dawson's expression shifted as she sized Derek up. "You've been working with Maurice, haven't you?" she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "You think your little legal tricks will save him? It's over for you both." Derek's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "It's never over, Dawson. Not as long as we're still standing." Blake, who had been silent until now, let out a bitter laugh. "What is this, some kind of rescue mission?" You two think you can outsmart us? It's over. You're both finished? Maurice felt the pressure building as the walls seemed to close in around them once again. Blake's threats were still sharp, but they didn't carry the same weight anymore. With Derek here, they had an ally. Someone who could challenge the legal forces working against them. Maurice glanced at Derek, his mind racing. How had Derek managed to get in? What was he planning? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but at the same time, he felt a surge of hope. Maybe there was a way out of this. Maybe they could turn the tables and finally expose the truth. Dawson's gaze flicked between Maurice and Derek, and for the first time, Maurice saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. It was brief, but it was there. She didn't know how much they knew, how much they were capable of, and that made her dangerous. But it also made her vulnerable. Dawson, now visibly irritated, took a step toward Derek, her voice cold as ice. You have no idea what you're up against, do you? The system is in my control. I've got connections you'll never be able to touch. Derek didn't flinch. We're not interested in your connections, Dawson, he said, his tone unwavering. We're interested in the truth. And the truth is something you can't control. Maurice could see the cracks forming in Dawson's carefully crafted armor. She had underestimated them both, and now she was beginning to realize just how much trouble she was in. Derek's arrival had changed the game, and Maurice wasn't about to let her take control again. Maurice, still trying to piece everything together, took a step toward Derek, his voice low. How did you get in here? He asked, still in disbelief that Derek had made it this far. Derek gave him a small, reassuring smile. I have my ways, he said. I've been working on something that could give us the leverage we need. But we need to move quickly. This situation is escalating faster than we thought. Maurice nodded, his thoughts racing. They were on the verge of something big. Something that could finally bring down the corruption that had been poisoning the system for so long. But it wasn't over yet. They still had to outsmart Dawson, Blake, and anyone else who stood in their way. The game had shifted once again, and now, with Derek as an unexpected ally, Maurice knew that they had a fighting chance. But they couldn't afford to waste time. The clock was ticking, and the final showdown was drawing near. The weight of the situation settled heavily on Maurice's shoulders as he looked from Derek to Dawson. For the first time, he could feel the scales tipping in their favor, but only just. Dawson and Blake were still dangerous, still relentless in their pursuit of control. The momentary advantage Derek had given them was fleeting, and Maurice knew that they had to strike quickly. Derek's voice broke through the tension in the room. We don't have time to waste. They're going to come for us, Maurice. We need to act now if we're going to expose this corruption for good. Maurice nodded, his eyes narrowing with determination. He knew Derek was right. This was their one shot. If they hesitated, Dawson would find a way to regain control. And Maurice wasn't about to let that happen. They had come too far, faced too much, to back down now. Blake, still seated, seemed to sense the shift in the room. He glared at Derek, his hands clenched into fists. But his body was tense with uncertainty. Dawson, too, had taken a step back, her eyes flicking nervously from Derek to Maurice, trying to anticipate their next move. She wasn't used to being the one on the defensive. It was clear that the tables were turning, and she didn't like it. "What do you think you can do, Derek?" Dawson sneered, trying to regain her composure. "You think you can just walk in here and change everything? You've got nothing. You're just another pawn." Derek didn't flinch, his eyes steady as he met her gaze. "You're wrong, Dawson," he said quietly. "We've got everything we need to bring you down. The truth is on our side. And the truth is something you can't escape." Maurice could feel his pulse quicken as he watched the exchange. Derek's words were powerful, but the reality of the situation was still daunting. They had the evidence, yes, but Dawson and Blake were formidable opponents, and they would stop at nothing to silence the truth. Maurice turned to Derek, his mind working quickly. "What's the next step?" he asked, his voice low. Derek's eyes glinted with resolve. "We've got a few pieces of evidence we can use, but we need to get them to the right people. The public needs to see what's going on here. We need to put this in the hands of the press and law enforcement, not just the ones on Dawson's payroll." Maurice agreed. The system had been corrupted from the inside, but if they could break the chains that held it together, they could start to expose everything. They couldn't just take down Dawson and Blake. They had to expose the entire operation, the network that had allowed this corruption to fester for so long. Blake, clearly frustrated, stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. He slammed his hand down on the table, his face red with anger. "This ends now, Maurice! You're not going to win. You think you've got the upper hand, but you don't." Maurice locked eyes with him, his voice calm but resolute. "It's already over, Blake. You just don't know it yet." Dawson shot Blake a sharp look, her face a mask of fury. "Quiet," she hissed. "We're not done yet." Maurice could feel the shift in the air as Dawson's demeanor darkened. She had been caught off guard, but she wasn't going to admit defeat easily. She would fight to the bitter end, and Maurice knew that. But he also knew something else. Dawson wasn't the only one with power in this room anymore. They had allies, people who were willing to stand up for what was right. And they were ready to fight. Dawson seemed to calculate her next move, her cold eyes darting between Maurice, Derek, and Blake. She knew that Maurice had gained the upper hand, but she wasn't going to make it easy for him. Her hands clenched into fists, and for a moment, Maurice could see the desperation behind her composure. "It's over for you, Dawson?" Maurice said again, his voice stronger this time. "The truth is coming, and no one can stop it." Dawson's expression flickered with a mix of fury and fear. "You think you've won, don't you?" She spat, her voice trembling with rage. "But you haven't. You're just as trapped as you were before. You're all just pawns in a game you'll never win." Maurice felt the weight of her words, but they didn't hold the same power they once had. Dawson had underestimated him from the start, thinking that he was just another victim of the system. But he wasn't. He was a fighter. He was willing to risk everything to expose the truth. Dawson, realizing that she was losing control, made a sudden move. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed a number. Maurice's heart raced. He knew that Dawson was trying to call in reinforcements, to bring in people who could stop them. But Maurice wasn't about to let that happen. In a flash, Maurice lunged forward, knocking the phone from Dawson's hand before she could make the call. It landed on the floor, skidding out of reach. Dawson's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment she froze. Maurice's voice was low and dangerous. "You're done, Dawson. You've lost. And now you'll have to face the consequences of your actions." Dawson's face twisted with rage as she lunged at him, but Maurice was ready. He stepped back quickly, his hands raised in defense. He wasn't going to fight her physically. He had bigger plans. He had the truth on his side, and that was all he needed. Blake, still standing behind her, looked at Dawson with a mix of confusion and hesitation. "What now?" he asked, his voice uncertain. Dawson's eyes locked onto Maurice, her face a mask of anger. "We're not finished yet," she snarled. But in that moment, Maurice knew that the battle was almost over. They had exposed the corruption. They had the evidence. And it was time for the world to see the truth. The room felt colder now. The confrontation had reached its peak, and Maurice could sense the shift. Dawson and Blake were no longer as certain of their victory. They had been so sure, so confident in their control. But now the pieces were beginning to fall apart. Maurice could feel the weight of the moment. They had been fighting for so long, and this was the turning point. The moment when everything changed. Maurice turned to Derek, his eyes focused and intent. "What now?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. Derek was his ally now, and his guidance was crucial. They couldn't afford any more mistakes. Derek's expression was calm, but there was a fire in his eyes, one that spoke of years of frustration with the system and a deep desire for justice. "We need to expose them for what they are," he said. "We can't just rely on the evidence. We need to make sure that everyone knows what's been happening here. This isn't just about you, Maurice. This is about everyone they've hurt." Maurice nodded, feeling the weight of Derek's words. This wasn't just his fight anymore. This was bigger than him. This was about the people who had been hurt. The ones who had been silenced for so long. They were going to make sure their voices were heard, no matter the cost. Dawson's glare was icy, but Maurice could see the cracks in her armor. She wasn't as untouchable as she thought. Her empire was crumbling, and she could feel it. Blake, on the other hand, was becoming more frantic. His nervous energy was palpable as he shifted from foot to foot, glancing at the door as if waiting for someone to come in and rescue them. Maurice, though, wasn't going to wait around. He wasn't going to let them run the show anymore. With Derek's help, they had the power to bring this all to light. "We need to get the evidence out," Maurice said, his voice firm. "We can't wait for the authorities to act. We need to go public." "Derek, do you have any contacts who can help us?" Derek thought for a moment before nodding. "I have a few people who are well connected in the media," he said. "But we'll need to move quickly. Dawson and Blake have connections of their own. The longer we wait, the harder it will be to get the truth out." Maurice's mind raced as he considered their options. It was dangerous, but it was the only way. He knew they couldn't trust anyone in the system right now. Not fully. They had to take matters into their own hands. Dawson, seeing that Maurice and Derek were plotting their next move, seethed with frustration. "This isn't over," she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "You think you can just walk away from this? I'll make sure you both pay for this." Maurice met her gaze, unflinching. "You can try, but you won't succeed," he said, his voice calm but firm. "The truth is already out there, Dawson. It's only a matter of time before everyone knows who you really are." For the first time, Maurice could see the panic flicker in Dawson's eyes. She had built her entire career on lies and manipulation. But now those lies were crumbling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Blake, now visibly shaken, stepped forward, his voice trembling with anger. "You can't do this!" he shouted. "You'll regret this, Maurice. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Maurice looked at him, a sense of calm settling over him. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Blake," he said quietly. "And it's over." The tension in the room was palpable as the final moments of their confrontation drew near. Dawson's cold demeanor had given way to something more desperate. Blake, still trying to regain control, was grasping at straws. They were losing, and they knew it. Maurice turned to Derek, a final plan forming in his mind. "We need to get to the media now," he said. "We can't wait any longer." Derek nodded in agreement. "Let's make this count." As they moved toward the door, Maurice glanced back one last time at Dawson and Blake. The fight wasn't over yet, but they had already won. The truth had begun to spread, and there was no turning back. Maurice's heart raced as he stepped into the elevator with Derek, the sound of the doors closing echoing through the small, silent space. The weight of the last few minutes pressed heavily on him. He had finally done it. He had confronted the corrupt system head-on, and with Derek's help, they had taken the first step toward exposing the truth. But the battle was far from over. It had only just begun. As the elevator descended, Maurice reflected on everything that had led to this moment. The sleepless nights, the research, the risks, they all paled in comparison to the mountain that still lay ahead. Dawson and Blake had been powerful adversaries, but now they were exposed. Their grip on the system was slipping, but it wasn't over yet. They were dangerous, and they would stop at nothing to protect themselves. Maurice's thoughts were interrupted by Derek's voice. "We can't afford to slow down now. They won't give up without a fight. And if we want to make sure this goes public, we have to act fast." Maurice nodded. "I know, Derek. But this is bigger than just us. We have to make sure the world knows. We have to make sure we're not just telling the story, but showing it. Dawson and Blake need to be held accountable for what they've done." Derek's eyes hardened with resolve. "And we will. We've got the evidence. The press is waiting, and once we get it to them, it'll be impossible for Dawson and Blake to escape the truth. But we have to move quickly." The elevator dinged as it reached the ground floor, and they stepped out into the bustling lobby. Maurice's mind was still racing, but there was a sense of urgency in the air now. Every moment counted. They couldn't let Dawson and Blake regain control. Maurice led the way to the parking garage, where Derek's car was parked. As they walked, Maurice noticed a few people giving them curious glances. They had no idea what was about to unfold, but Maurice could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The truth was coming, and it was going to change everything. As they reached the car, Maurice glanced over his shoulder, a sense of unease settling over him. They had made their move, but now they had to deal with the fallout. Dawson and Blake wouldn't go down easily. And there were others. People who had been complicit in their schemes, who would likely try to cover their tracks. But Maurice wasn't worried. Not anymore. He had Derek by his side, and they had the evidence. They had the power to expose everything. They just had to get it into the right hands. Derek opened the car door and slid into the driver's seat. Maurice followed, his mind already focused on the next steps. The press conference wasn't far off, but they needed to be strategic. They couldn't just hand over the evidence and hope for the best. They had to control the narrative. "You ready for this?" Derek asked, his voice low but filled with determination. Maurice nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settle on him. More than ever, this was about more than just him. This was about everyone who had suffered because of the corruption they were fighting to expose. This was about justice. As Derek started the car, Maurice looked out the window, his thoughts racing. They had the evidence, but now they had to face the storm that was coming. They couldn't back down now. The drive to the press conference was quiet, each man lost in his own thoughts. Maurice knew that once the truth was out, there would be no turning back. But that was the price of justice. It was a heavy burden, but it was one that he was ready to bear. The press conference was just the beginning. Dawson and Blake weren't going to go down without a fight, and Maurice knew that. but he was ready. Ready to face whatever came next. As they pulled up to the building, Maurice's pulse quickened. This was it. The moment when everything changed. He could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. But he knew it was worth it. They parked the car and stepped out, moving quickly toward the entrance. Maurice's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out, seeing a message from an unknown number. It's done. The public knows. Get ready. Maurice's heart skipped a beat. The world was about to change. Maurice's pulse quickened as he read the message. The weight of it settled over him, but there was no time for hesitation. The public knew. The storm that had been building for weeks was about to hit, and Maurice could feel the pressure mounting. Derek, walking beside him, must have sensed the change in his demeanor. "What is it?" Derek asked, his voice sharp with concern. Maurice looked up, meeting Derek's gaze. "The public knows," he said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "The story is already out there. Now we just have to make sure we control the narrative. We can't let Dawson and Blake twist it." Derek nodded. "We're ready. Let's get to the press conference and make sure they hear our side." The building loomed ahead, a modern structure with glass walls that seemed to reflect the world outside. Maurice and Derek moved through the entrance, greeted by the hum of reporters and camera crews setting up for the conference. The buzz of anticipation filled the air, and Maurice could feel the weight of the moment. He had no idea what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. They couldn't afford to mess this up. As they stepped into the room, a wave of reporters turned to face them, their cameras flashing, microphones extended. The lights were bright, and Maurice's mind raced as he prepared for what was to come. It wasn't just about telling the truth anymore. It was about making sure everyone understood it. A reporter at the front of the room raised his hand, and Maurice nodded in his direction. "What do you have to say about the accusations against you?" the reporter asked, his voice cutting through the noise of the room. Maurice took a deep breath. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment to speak the truth. He glanced at Derek, who gave him an encouraging nod before turning to face the crowd of reporters. First off, Maurice began, his voice steady, but filled with determination. "I want to make it clear that what you've heard about me and Derek is not just some story. It's the truth. The system is broken, and we've been fighting to expose the corruption that has hurt countless people." He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle in. "I've spent years working to make things right, to create a company that supports people, not exploits them. But what I discovered, what we all discovered, is that the people we trusted to lead this organization, the people who were supposed to be setting an example, were lying to us. They were taking advantage of those who had no voice. They were feeding a system that was built on exploitation, manipulation, and deceit." Maurice felt a surge of anger, but he kept his voice calm. He needed to remain in control. Dawson and Blake are at the center of this, he continued. They've been hiding behind a curtain of power, manipulating the truth to protect their own interests. But now, it's time for that to end. We're here today to make sure that the truth comes out. We're here to expose the lies, the manipulation, and the harm they've caused. And we're not stopping until justice is served. A murmur rippled through the room. The reporters exchanging glances as they processed what Maurice had just said. Derek stood beside him, his presence a silent strength. Together, they had fought for this moment, and now they had to make sure it counted. Maurice's eyes scanned the room, locking eyes with one reporter after another. He could feel the weight of their questions, but he was ready. He had nothing to hide. A reporter raised her hand. "Maurice," she began, "there have been rumors that Dawson and Blake are already preparing a response to these accusations. How do you plan to defend yourself when they attempt to discredit your claims?" Maurice didn't flinch. "I'm not worried about their response," he said firmly. "The truth speaks for itself. The evidence is undeniable. We have everything we need to back up our claims. What we're doing today is simply giving the public the facts. They can try to twist the narrative, but it won't work. The truth is already out there, and they can't change that." Another reporter chimed in. "What about the future of your company? Will the corruption you've uncovered affect the employees who depend on you?" Maurice took a deep breath, his gaze steady. "This is about more than just my company," he said. "It's about creating a better future. A future where employees are treated with respect. Where people don't have to live in fear of those in power. We're making changes. The company will continue. But we're taking a hard look at how we do things. We're going to rebuild from the ground up. And this time, we're doing it right." The reporters continued to ask questions, but Maurice felt a sense of calm wash over him. The truth was out. There was no turning back. As the questions came, he answered them with conviction, his resolve unwavering. Behind him, Derek remained silent but vigilant. He knew that the real work was still ahead. But for the first time in a long time, there was a sense of hope. They had done it. The truth had been set free, and now it was up to the world to listen. As the press conference came to an end, Maurice felt a sense of accomplishment. They had exposed the lies, and now the world would know the truth. But there was still a long road ahead. Dawson and Blake weren't going to go down without a fight, and Maurice knew that. But for now, they had won. As Maurice and Derek walked out of the press conference room, the noise of the media and the flashing lights faded behind them. But the weight of the moment still pressed on them. The storm was only beginning. What they had just unleashed wasn't going to be easily contained, and Maurice knew that. Dawson and Blake were already preparing their counterattack. The real fight had only just begun. Outside, The air was thick with anticipation. Maurice and Derek made their way through the crowd of reporters, each camera aimed at them, as if waiting for the next piece of the story. Maurice's thoughts raced as they stepped into the parking lot. The world was watching now, and he had to make sure they didn't lose control of the narrative. He could already hear the whispers, the rumors, the questions that would follow in the coming hours. "Maurice," Derek said as they reached the car, "we've taken the first step, but it won't be long before Dawson and Blake strike back. We need to stay ahead of them." Maurice nodded, his mind already focused on the next steps. "I know. This is just the beginning, Derek. But we can't back down now. The truth is out there, and we've already given it to the world. We need to make sure they can't bury it." Derek slid into the driver's seat, starting the car with a soft hum. They had their work cut out for them. But Maurice wasn't worried. Not anymore. This was a battle worth fighting, and they had the truth on their side. No one could take that from them. As they drove through the city streets, Maurice's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, seeing a string of messages from his team. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the first one. "The backlash is already starting. They're attacking us on social media. The accusations are coming fast and furious." Maurice let out a breath, running a hand through his hair. It was exactly what he had feared. Dawson and Blake weren't going to go quietly into the night. They were going to fight back, and they had the resources to do it. But Maurice wasn't about to let them win. "They can say whatever they want," Maurice said, his voice steady. "The truth is still the truth. But we need to be prepared. We need to get ahead of this before they can spin their lies any further." Derek glanced at Maurice as he drove. "What do you want to do?" Maurice thought for a moment, his mind racing. "We need to start gathering support," he said. "People need to hear our side. We can't just rely on the media to tell the story. We need to go directly to the people. Show them the evidence. Explain why this matters. The more people who know the truth, the harder it will be for Dawson and Blake to control the narrative." Derek nodded. "I can make some calls. We'll get some people in place to help spread the word." Maurice's mind was already working out the logistics. They needed to be smart about this. The last thing they wanted was to make themselves a target for Dawson and Blake's media machine. But they couldn't hide either. They had to stand strong, show the world they weren't afraid, and keep pushing forward. As they drove, the city passed by in a blur. Maurice's thoughts were consumed by the looming battle. The backlash from Dawson and Blake's camp was already in full swing, and Maurice knew they had to prepare for a fight like had never seen before. But he was ready. They had no choice but to stay the course. The truth had been unleashed, and there was no way to put it back. By the time they reached the office, Maurice felt a sense of urgency settle over him. He needed to get ahead of the chaos before it could consume them. They couldn't afford to waste any time. They went straight to work, organizing a strategy to combat the backlash. Maurice spoke with his team, coordinating efforts to keep the narrative on track. He knew that the real challenge would come in the next few hours. Dawson and Blake's response would be swift, and it would be ruthless. But Maurice was ready to take it on. As the hours passed, the media storm intensified. The news outlets were buzzing with the revelations from the press conference, but the attacks from Dawson and Blake's camp were coming just as fast. There were smear campaigns, misleading reports, and a flood of social media posts designed to undermine Maurice and Derek's credibility. But Maurice wasn't intimidated. He had faced worse in his career. This was just another hurdle to overcome. And with Derek by his side, he knew they could fight back. They had to. Maurice watched the unfolding drama from his office, his gaze unwavering. This was his moment. They had the truth, and they weren't backing down. Not now, not ever. By the next morning, the media landscape had already shifted. Maurice could feel the pressure mounting with every passing second. What had started as a hopeful moment of truth was quickly morphing into a full-fledged battle for control of the narrative. Dawson and Blake had launched their counterattack with precision, flooding the airwaves with their side of the story. They weren't just trying to discredit Maurice and Derek. They were trying to rewrite history. Maurice sat at his desk, his fingers tapping against the surface as he scrolled through the latest reports. The headlines screamed at him from the screen. Accusations of lies, misrepresentations, and even personal attacks. Dawson and Blake were pulling no punches. They were using every tool at their disposal: social media campaigns, interviews with sympathetic outlets, and even anonymous sources who claimed to have inside knowledge of Maurice's supposed wrongdoing. They weren't playing fair, but Maurice had known this was coming. He couldn't let their lies go unanswered. He needed to take control of the narrative before it got away from him. Derek, who had been on the phone coordinating with their allies, walked into the room, his face tight with concern. "They're pushing back hard," Derek said, his voice low. "The pressure's building, and I'm not sure how much longer we can keep up with their response. We need a new strategy." Maurice's mind raced. They had already responded to the media, but it wasn't enough. Dawson and Blake were too powerful, and their reach was massive. They needed something more. Something that would not only counter the lies, but expose their tactics for what they truly were. Maurice leaned back in his chair, his fingers lacing together. "What if we hit them where it hurts the most?" he asked, his voice growing steadier with each word. "We need to go public with the proof. The documents, the recordings, everything. We've been holding back. But it's time to show the world exactly what they've been hiding." Derek raised an eyebrow. "You think it'll make a difference?" "Dawson and Blake are going to try to bury that too. They've got resources to make sure the truth doesn't get out. Maurice nodded. That's exactly why we have to be smart. We release the documents in stages. We have to make them undeniable. And this time, we need to do it through channels they can't control. If they try to bury it, people will notice. We'll make sure the public knows they're hiding something. Derek's expression shifted as he considered the plan. You're right. We need to go beyond the press conference and social media. We need the people on our side. If we expose everything, there will be no way they can spin it. Maurice stood up, pacing across the room. We'll start with the documents. Every single one that proves their corruption. Then we'll release the recordings, the ones where Dawson and Blake are caught in their lies. But we can't just drop it all at once. We need to keep the pressure on them. We have to give the public the chance to see who these people really are. Derek nodded, his mind working quickly. We can start with an exclusive leak to a trusted journalist. Someone who'll report it in full, without editing or changing the story. Once it's out there, the floodgates will open. The truth will come out. Maurice smiled grimly. Exactly. We need a whistleblower who can't be silenced. And once the public sees what's really going on behind closed doors, we won't need to do much more. The backlash will be enough to take them down. As Derek made the necessary calls to get the leak in motion, Maurice turned his attention to the final piece of the puzzle. They needed to be prepared for the backlash. Dawson and Blake wouldn't just take this lying down. They would fight back, and they would do it dirty. But Maurice wasn't about to let that stop him. The truth was on their side, and now it was time to make sure the world knew it. Within hours, the first documents were leaked to the public. Maurice watched as the news spread like wildfire, the media picking up the story faster than he could have anticipated. His phone buzzed non-stop with updates and messages. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. The backlash from Dawson and Blake was swift. They denounced the leaked documents as fabrications, called the whistleblower a disgruntled former employee with an agenda, and attempted to discredit the entire story. But it wasn't enough. People weren't buying it anymore. Too many questions had been raised, and now there were answers to back them up. Maurice watched as the world began to turn against Dawson and Blake. The public outcry was deafening. Social media erupted with hashtags demanding accountability. People who had once been loyal to the company began to speak out, sharing their own stories of how they had been mistreated, manipulated, or ignored by the very people they had trusted. The tide was turning. Maurice knew it, and Derek knew it too. But there was no time to relax. They still had to make sure the truth kept flowing, that there was no room for Dawson and Blake to regroup and mount a new defense. Derek came back into the room, his face grim. "They're already preparing a new attack," he said, shaking his head. "This won't be easy." Maurice met his gaze, his jaw set in determination. Let them come. They won't stop us. We're taking this all the way. With the battle now fully underway, Maurice and Derek braced themselves for whatever Dawson and Blake had left. The fight for justice had become a war, and Maurice wasn't about to lose. Not now. Not ever. By now, the pressure had reached a boiling point. Maurice could feel it every time he walked into a room. His every move, every word, was scrutinized. The media had shifted gears, no longer simply covering the story, but now questioning every detail, trying to dig deeper, to find any flaw in his campaign for justice. But Maurice had prepared for this moment. The fight was far from over, and it was time for one final push. The documents had done their job. Dawson and Blake's camp was scrambling to respond, but each new attempt to discredit the truth only made the situation worse for them. Public opinion was starting to turn. People were seeing through the lies. Maurice had become a symbol of resilience, a leader who was standing firm against the powers that tried to silence him. But there was still one thing left to do: finish what they had started. Maurice had one final ace up his sleeve, something that would leave no doubt in anyone's mind about who was truly in the wrong. As he sat in his office, staring at the screen of his laptop, his fingers hovered over the keys. It was time. He had one last piece of evidence: video footage. The kind of evidence that couldn't be ignored or manipulated. It was the smoking gun. Maurice's phone rang, snapping him from his thoughts. He picked it up without hesitation. Derek's voice came through, strained but filled with determination. "It's time, Maurice. The press conference is set. Are we ready?" Maurice took a deep breath, glancing at the file on his laptop. "We're ready, Derek. This is the moment we've been waiting for. We're going to end this, once and for all." The plan was simple, yet powerful. They would go public with the footage, the evidence that could not be denied. A video showing Dawson and Blake in a private meeting, discussing their corrupt dealings, mocking the very people they claimed to be helping. It would be the final nail in their coffin. The world would see them for what they truly were. Maurice met Derek at the press conference venue. A large room filled with reporters, cameras, and a palpable sense of anticipation. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Maurice could feel the weight of the moment, but he wasn't afraid. He was ready to face whatever came next. As he walked to the podium, the reporters quieted, their eyes locked on him. Maurice took a deep breath, his heart pounding. He knew what he had to do. It was time to tell the world the full truth. "Ladies and gentlemen," Maurice began, his voice steady and strong, "we've been through a lot over the past few days. But today, we take the final step. The truth is no longer a matter of opinion. It's a matter of fact." He paused, allowing the words to settle. The crowd was silent, waiting for the next revelation. "What you're about to see is undeniable," Maurice continued. "This is the proof that Dawson and Blake are guilty of the crimes they've been hiding. No more lies. No more manipulation. The truth will speak for itself. With that, Maurice clicked a button on his laptop, and the screen behind him flickered to life. The video played, showing Dawson and Blake in a private meeting, laughing about the very people they had exploited. They mocked the employees, the customers, and the communities they claimed to serve. Maurice watched the room's reaction as the footage played out. The reporters gasped. The room filled with a collective sense of shock and disbelief. As the video ended, Maurice stepped back from the podium, his heart still racing. He knew that there was no coming back from this for Dawson and Blake. The truth was out there, and the world could see it for what it was. The room exploded into chaos. Reporters shouted questions, scrambling to get the first exclusive angle on the story. Maurice stood firm, knowing that he had done what he needed to do. The battle for justice had reached its climax, and now it was time for the world to decide. In the days that followed, the media coverage was relentless. The video went viral, spreading across every platform imaginable. Dawson and Blake's defenses crumbled, their empire built on lies and deceit now falling apart. Maurice watched as the public turned against them. The very people they had once relied on, now calling for their accountability. But Maurice wasn't done yet. This wasn't just about bringing down two corrupt businessmen. This was about sending a message that no one, no matter how powerful, was above the law. That justice would always prevail, no matter how hard the fight. As Maurice sat in his office, looking out over the city, Derek walked in, a smile on his face. "You did it, Maurice. We did it." Maurice returned the smile, but his mind was already focused on what came next. The fight for justice was never truly over. But today, they had won. And that was something worth celebrating. The fallout from the press conference was immediate and overwhelming. Maurice couldn't escape the flood of messages, calls, and media requests that came in the days following the release of the explosive footage. His life, which had once been defined by hard work and perseverance, was now defined by something much bigger, a fight for justice. It didn't take long for Dawson and Blake to start losing their grip. Their public relations teams scrambled to downplay the video's authenticity, but it was too late. The truth had already taken root. People were talking, and they were angry. The public backlash against Dawson and Blake grew louder by the hour. Even so, Maurice knew that this victory wasn't just about seeing them fall. It was about the countless others who had suffered under their corruption. The employees, the customers, and the families whose lives had been impacted by their greed. He couldn't let the victory feel empty. It wasn't enough to just tear them down. He needed to rebuild what had been broken. As Maurice met with his team to discuss the next steps, Derek looked at him with a mix of admiration and concern. "What's next for us, Maurice? How do we move forward from here?" Maurice sighed, rubbing his eyes. "There's still a lot of work to be done. We can't just walk away and assume everything will fix itself. We need to make sure the changes we're pushing for stick. We need to restore faith in the system. Derek nodded. That's true. But we've made a difference. This is bigger than just one company. We've shown people that they have the power to stand up for what's right. Maurice looked out the window, his mind spinning. It was hard to believe just a few months ago. Everything had seemed so uncertain. He had questioned whether his actions would make a difference. Now, there was no doubt in his mind. But he also knew that this wasn't the end. It wasn't enough to bring down two corrupt men. The system that allowed them to thrive needed to be changed from the top down. He had the resources now, the platform, and the influence to make a lasting impact. But he needed to be smart. He needed to play the long game. What Maurice didn't expect was the wave of support that came pouring in. People across the country reached out, applauding his courage and offering to help him push for broader reforms. Local organizations, activists, and even some politicians voiced their support. It was clear that what he had done was bigger than just one battle. It was the beginning of a larger movement for accountability and change. Maurice spent the next few weeks meeting with stakeholders, allies, and advocates who shared his vision. They began crafting a new initiative, one that would promote corporate accountability, protect whistleblowers, and ensure that no one could escape justice because of their position or wealth. Meanwhile, Dawson and Blake were fighting an uphill battle. Their business empire was crumbling, and the legal battles they faced seemed insurmountable. Investors pulled out, employees quit in droves, and their personal lives were under a microscope. It was the kind of public downfall that Maurice had once dreamed of. But now that it was happening, he didn't feel a sense of satisfaction. Instead, he felt a quiet resolve. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about creating something better in the world, for all those who had been hurt. Months passed, and as the dust settled, Maurice found himself becoming a leading voice in the fight for social justice. He was invited to speak at conferences, consulted by legal experts, and featured in major media outlets. But he remained grounded. Every time someone congratulated him or offered praise, he thought of the people who were still struggling. He hadn't forgotten their faces. The employees who had been mistreated, the families who had been torn apart by corporate greed. Maurice wasn't done yet. He knew this was just the beginning. And then came the call he had been waiting for. Derek picked up the phone and passed it to Maurice, his expression serious. It was from the government. They wanted him to take on a new role, one that would allow him to influence policy on a national scale. Maurice hesitated. It was a huge opportunity, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to leave behind the work he had started. He had worked so hard to expose the corruption in the corporate world. The fight wasn't over. But as he sat back and thought about the bigger picture, He realized that this was exactly what he had been working toward. With the right platform, he could help more people push for deeper systemic change and ensure that his fight for justice didn't stop with just one company. He took a deep breath, a small smile tugging at his lips. It was time for the next chapter. And with that, Maurice stepped into his new role, determined to continue the fight for justice on an even larger scale. The struggle was far from over, but now, more than ever, he knew that he had the power to make a difference.